January 17, 1945, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Snow falls in thick curtains across the broken landscape. A young Jeffreiter of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division crouches inside what remains of an American foxhole, his breath crystallizing in the air before him. His hands, purple with frostbite, work mechanically to pry open a small waxed cardboard box he discovered half buried in the frozen mud. The box is brown, compact, remarkably intact, despite the artillery barrage that swept through this position hours earlier. Stenciled on its side in black letters are words he cannot fully comprehend. U.S. Army Field Ration K. The soldier has not eaten a proper meal in 4 days. His unit's supply lines collapsed somewhere east of Bastogne, swallowed by the winter and the chaos of Germany's last great offensive in the West. He tears at the box with desperate fingers, and what spills into his lap seems impossible, almost obscene in its abundance. Cigarettes, a tin of processed meat, biscuits wrapped in cellophane, powdered coffee, sugar tablets, chewing gum, toilet paper, even a small packet containing matches that still strike despite the moisture. The Jeffreiter stares at these items spread across his thighs, and something fundamental shifts in his understanding of the war. This is not the ration of an army on the edge of collapse. This is not the meager sustenance of soldiers clinging to survival. This is proof of something he had never truly believed, something the Reichsministerium broadcasts had assured him was American propaganda and Jewish lies. The enemy possesses resources beyond imagination, industrial capacity beyond reason, and a society capable of feeding its warriors like kings, while simultaneously crushing the Third Reich beneath the weight of its material abundance. He bites into the biscuit, and the taste is foreign, chemical, preserved with compounds unknown to German field bakeries, but it is food, real food. Calories measured and packaged and distributed with the casual efficiency of a nation that wastes more in a day than the Wehrmacht can scrape together in a week. The Jeffreiter eats everything in the box, even the bouillon powder he pours directly onto his tongue, and when he finishes, he understands with terrible clarity that Germany has already lost this war. Not on the battlefield, though that too is inevitable now. Germany lost the moment it declared war on a country capable of engineering victory into a cardboard box small enough to fit in a soldier's pocket. The K-Ration was never supposed to be a weapon. It was designed in 1942 by physiologist Ansel Keys, a researcher at the University of Minnesota, tasked with solving a mundane logistical problem: how to feed highly mobile American forces operating in environments where traditional field kitchens could not follow. Keys understood that modern mechanized warfare demanded a complete reimagining of military nutrition. Soldiers advancing in tanks, paratroopers descending behind enemy lines, reconnaissance units operating for days without resupply. These men needed sustenance that was lightweight, durable, nutritionally complete, and above all, abundant. The K-Ration was his answer. 3 boxes per day, breakfast, dinner, and supper, each containing approximately 2,830 calories delivered through a carefully calculated combination of canned meat, fortified biscuits, dried fruit, chocolate, coffee, sugar, and cigarettes. By 1943, American factories were producing K-Rations at a rate that would have seemed fantastical to any European power. The Wrigley Company in Chicago devoted entire production lines to manufacturing chewing gum exclusively for military rations. Nestle reformulated its chocolate bars to remain solid at temperatures up to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The Hormel Foods Corporation engineered new canning processes for chopped ham and eggs that would remain edible for years. In a single month, American industry could produce more K-Rations than Germany manufactured in an entire quarter. This was not merely efficiency. This was abundance weaponized, prosperity converted into strategic advantage. The full industrial might of a continental economy mobilized, not just to build tanks and bombers, but to ensure that every American soldier, everywhere, at all times, would eat better than the citizens of any Axis nation. German soldiers encountering K-Rations, for the first time, experienced a cognitive rupture that propaganda could not repair. The official narrative taught in every Wehrmacht training facility, printed in every military manual, broadcast from every radio tower in the Reich, insisted that America was a decadent plutocracy teetering on the edge of social collapse. Americans were soft, corrupted by jazz music and Hollywood films, divided by racial tensions and labor strikes, led by a crippled president and manipulated by Jewish The German soldier was told he represented a superior civilization, disciplined and unified, defending European culture against mongrel democracy. But the K-Ration told a different story. It spoke of factories that never stopped, farms that produced surpluses so vast that feeding an army of millions barely strained the civilian food supply, and a society organized with such methodical precision that even its emergency field rations contained luxuries: toilet paper, cigarettes, chewing gum that German troops could not dream of receiving. Obergefreiter Klaus Huber, captured during the Battle of the Bulge and processed through a prisoner of war facility in France, later recorded his memories of that first encounter with American military rations in a memoir, published in 1958. He wrote, "We had been told the Americans were starving, that their factories were idle, that their Negro soldiers were forced to fight at gunpoint. Then I opened a K-Ration box and found more food than I had seen in 3 years of military service. There were crackers that did not crumble, meat that tasted fresh despite being sealed in tin, coffee strong enough to burn your throat, and chocolate so rich I could barely swallow it. I remember thinking, if this is what they discard in retreat, what abundance must exist in America itself." The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. German military doctrine had been constructed around the concept of Bejagungskrieg, mobile warfare sustained by rapid conquest and the exploitation of captured resources. Nazi Germany's war economy depended fundamentally on plunder: Ukrainian wheat, Romanian oil, French industry, Polish labor. The Third Reich never achieved genuine economic self-sufficiency, never developed the industrial base necessary to sustain a multi-year conflict against peer adversaries. German soldiers went to war expecting short, decisive campaigns followed by victory and occupation. Instead, they found themselves locked in a grinding war of attrition against enemies whose productive capacity seemed limitless. And nowhere was this disparity more visible, more visceral, more personally devastating than in the contents of a K-Ration box. By 1944, as the Wehrmacht retreated across France and the Red Army advanced through Poland, German supply lines had degraded to the point of dysfunction. Soldiers received perhaps one hot meal every 3 days, supplemented by hard-bread ersatz, coffee made from roasted acorns, and occasionally a tin of preserved fish. Butter was a memory. Fresh meat existed only in the officers' mess. Fruit was legendary. The standard German field ration, when available, consisted of approximately 1,800 calories, delivered primarily through black bread, margarine, and canned vegetables. It was enough to prevent starvation, but only just. German soldiers operated in a state of perpetual hunger, their bodies slowly consuming themselves, their combat effectiveness degrading with every missed meal. And then they captured an American supply depot, or overran a hastily abandoned American position, or simply stumbled across the detritus left behind by advancing American units who discarded equipment and supplies with casual indifference because more would arrive tomorrow. And tomorrow after that, an endless stream of material pouring across the Atlantic from a homeland that suffered no bombings, no invasion, no devastation. German soldiers gorged themselves on K-Rations and C-rations and stuffed their packs with Hershey bars and Spam and instant coffee, and understood with sickening finality that they were fighting a war that could not be won through courage or discipline or ideological fervor. They were fighting industrial mathematics, and the equation always resolved in favor of America. The symbolism of the K-Ration extended far beyond its nutritional content. Each component represented a different facet of American abundance. The cigarette Scamel, Lucky Strike, Chesterfield came from tobacco plantations in North Carolina and Virginia, industries so productive they could afford to reserve entire harvests for military consumption while still supplying civilian markets. The chewing gum, dismissed by German propagandists as evidence of American juvenility, was actually a technological marvel, a carefully engineered product that improved concentration, reduced stress, and helped maintain oral hygiene under field conditions. The toilet paper, perhaps most shocking of all to German troops accustomed to using newspaper or leaves, demonstrated a society that prioritized basic dignity even in combat. The powdered coffee, so strong it bordered on undrinkable for European palates, came from plantations in Brazil and Colombia, evidence of American commercial networks spanning the globe. Every element of the K-Ration testified to a civilization operating at a scale that Axis powers could not match. Japanese soldiers experienced similar revelations in the Pacific Theater. Though their encounters with American abundance carried different cultural resonances, the Japanese military had prepared for war based on the assumption that American forces would crack under the pressure of prolonged conflict, that a society obsessed with comfort and materialism would lose its will to fight once casualties mounted. Instead, Japanese troops discovered that American abundance actually strengthened resolve. The K-Ration, universally despised by American soldiers who complained about its monotony and its artificial taste, represented a standard of nutrition that Japanese troops would have considered luxurious. A single American field ration contained more calories than the average Japanese soldier received in an entire day. The chocolate bars are dense, fortified with vitamins, engineered to resist tropical heat, provided more energy than the rice balls and pickled vegetables that constituted standard Japanese military fare. On Guadalcanal, Japanese forces attempting to recapture Henderson Field found themselves attacking American positions where discarded K-Ration boxes littered the ground like autumn leaves. Japanese officers examining these boxes confronted evidence that contradicted every assumption about American military capacity. The rations were dated, stamped with production codes that indicated they had been manufactured just weeks earlier in factories thousands of miles away, transported across the Pacific in refrigerated cargo ships, and distributed to frontline units with such casual efficiency that American soldiers threw away food Japanese troops would have treasured. Lieutenant Colonel Kiyono Ichiki, whose detachment was annihilated during the Battle of the Tenaru, reportedly told his surviving officers before launching his final attack that they were fighting not just an army but an industrial system, and that Japan's only hope lay in the spiritual superiority that would allow them to overcome material disadvantage through courage and sacrifice. His men charged American positions armed with bayonets and hand grenades, fueled by starvation and desperation, and were destroyed by automatic weapons fire from soldiers who had eaten hot coffee and canned meat for breakfast. The K-Ration served another crucial function that military planners had not fully anticipated. It became a tool of psychological warfare. American forces learned to leave K-Rations behind deliberately when abandoning positions, knowing that starving enemy soldiers would be unable to resist consuming them. German and Japanese troops who ate American rations experienced not just physical sustenance, but ideological contamination. The chocolate spoke of a society wealthy enough to treat sugar as a disposable commodity. The cigarettes came packaged with miniature bottles of matches, demonstrating an attention to detail that suggested systematic organizational capacity. The chewing gum, with its absurdly specific instructions printed in multiple languages, revealed a military establishment that anticipated every possible scenario. Even the packaging itself waxed cardboard, designed to resist moisture, printed with cheerful graphics and nutritional information communicated confidence and abundance. Some German units attempted to systematically collect and redistribute captured American rations to prevent their soldiers from confronting the reality of American productive capacity. SS officers recognized that exposure to K-Rations could damage morale more effectively than enemy propaganda leaflets. Orders were issued forbidding the consumption of American food, except under direct supervision, a policy that was universally ignored and impossible to enforce. Hungry men do not concern themselves with ideological purity when faced with actual calories, but the psychological damage had already been done. Every German soldier who ate an American K-Ration carried that knowledge forward, shared it with comrades, allowed it to spread through the ranks like a virus of understanding. The story repeated itself in whispered conversations across frozen foxholes and ruined buildings. The Americans have so much food they package it in boxes small enough to fit in your pocket, boxes they discard without thought, boxes that contain more nutrition than our entire day's ration. How can we defeat an enemy like that? The answer, of course, was that they could not. The K-Ration was merely the visible manifestation of a deeper reality. America's entry into World War II represented the mobilization of the world's largest economy in defense of principles that, whatever their contradictions and hypocrisies, proved materially more effective than fascist alternatives. The Third Reich built an empire on conquest and slavery, extracting resources from occupied territories while contributing nothing but exploitation and death. The Empire of Japan pursued autarky and military expansion, attempting to construct a self-sufficient sphere of influence through brutality and subjugation. The United States, for all its flaws and failures, had developed an economic system capable of producing surpluses so vast that feeding millions of soldiers represented a manageable logistical challenge rather than an existential crisis. Dr. Ancel Keys, the physiologist who designed the K-Rations, understood that nutrition was inseparable from morale. A well-fed soldier fights better, thinks more clearly, recovers from stress more quickly, and maintains discipline under pressure. But Keys also understood something more fundamental. The K-Ration needed to communicate American confidence. Every component was selected not just for nutritional value, but for psychological impact. The chewing gum said, "We are relaxed, casual, confident enough to include trivial luxuries in our emergency rations." The cigarette said, "We can afford to give our soldiers habits that consume resources for no military purpose." The toilet paper said, "We maintain standards of hygiene and dignity even in combat conditions." The coffee said, "We have access to global supply chains that your blockades cannot interdict." The chocolate said, "We are so wealthy that sugar is a weapon." German nutritionists, examining captured K-Rations in laboratory settings, produced reports that bordered on despair. The caloric density was higher than German field rations by almost 40%. The vitamin supplementation was comprehensive, designed to prevent scurvy and beriberi and night blindness. The packaging was superior, more resistant to moisture and impact. The shelf life was longer, measured in years rather than months. The variety was staggering. American soldiers could choose from multiple menu options, where German soldiers received whatever was available. Every technical analysis confirmed what common sense already suggested. America possessed the scientific knowledge, industrial capacity, and agricultural surplus necessary to feed its military better than Germany could feed its civilian population. This disparity had strategic implications that extended beyond individual combat effectiveness. Malnourished soldiers get sick more frequently, recover more slowly from wounds, and suffer higher rates of psychological breakdown. By 1945, German military hospitals were overwhelmed with cases of trench foot, dysentery, vitamin deficiency diseases, and stress-related disorders, all exacerbated by inadequate nutrition. American forces, sustained by K-Rations and supplemented by hot meals whenever possible, maintained combat effectiveness across extended campaigns. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive in the West, ultimately failed not because German soldiers lacked courage or tactical skill, but because they could not sustain operations without capturing American supply depots. The offensive ground to a halt, as much from hunger as from combat losses. German units literally running out of fuel and food simultaneously, while American forces, after initial setbacks, reorganized and counterattacked, with troops who had eaten breakfast. The symbolic power of the K-Ration reached its apex during the final months of the war. As Allied forces advanced into Germany itself, German civilians, subjected to years of propaganda about American degeneracy and weakness, encountered occupation troops distributing K-Rations to starving refugees and displaced persons. The same boxes that had sustained American soldiers in combat now fed German children, demonstrating with brutal clarity which system had proven more effective at organizing human society. The chocolate bars that had been designed to provide emergency energy to infantrymen became currency in a devastated economy. The cigarettes, intended to calm combat nerves, became more valuable than and everywhere, the packaging bright, optimistic, printed in English with that peculiar American confidence, announced the arrival of a new order. Japanese civilians experienced a parallel revelation during the American occupation. K-Rations distributed by occupation forces represented nutrition at a level most Japanese citizens had not experienced since before the war. The canned meat, the fortified biscuits, the instant coffee, these were not luxury items in America, merely standard military fare, yet they exceeded what Japanese wartime rations had provided to civilians or soldiers. The psychological impact was profound. For years, Japanese propaganda had insisted that American materialism represented spiritual weakness, that Japan's acceptance of hardship and sacrifice proved cultural superiority. But the K-Ration demonstrated that abundance and strength were not mutually exclusive. America could afford to feed its soldiers well precisely because its economic system generated surpluses. Hardship was not a virtue, it was a policy failure. The K-Ration also revealed something unexpected about American culture: the degree to which egalitarianism had been embedded in military organization. German field rations varied dramatically by rank, with officers receiving substantially better food than enlisted men. Japanese military culture accepted as natural that soldiers would go hungry while officers ate well. But American K-Rations were identical regardless of rank. A private in a foxhole ate the same ration as a colonel in a command post. This was not merely logistical efficiency, though it certainly simplified supply chains. It reflected a cultural assumption, imperfect and often contradicted in practice, that all soldiers deserved equal treatment, that individual worth was not determined by position in a hierarchy. German and Japanese prisoners of war, processed through American detention facilities, reported with astonishment that they received the same rations as their guards. This was incomprehensible under fascist logic, where inequality was considered natural and hierarchy sacred. It suggested a different organizing principle, one that valued standardization and fairness over the privileges of rank. By war's end, more than 105 billion K-Rations had been manufactured, enough to feed the entire population of the United States for nearly a month. The logistics of this achievement were staggering. Factories in 42 states participated in production. Transportation networks coordinated by the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps moved rations from manufacturing centers to ports, loaded them onto cargo ships protected by naval escorts, delivered them to supply depots on every continent, and distributed them to frontline units operating in deserts and jungles and frozen tundra. The system worked so effectively that American soldiers complained about menu monotony, rather than insufficient quantities, a problem that would have seemed absurd to any Axis soldier. The long-term impact of the K-Ration extended far beyond its immediate military purpose. German prisoners of war, returning home after years in Allied detention camps, brought with them memories of regular meals, adequate nutrition, and a food system that did not collapse under pressure. These memories corroded what remained of fascist ideology more effectively than any denazification program. Japanese civilians who survived the war's final months, when starvation became commonplace, remembered American rations with a clarity that shaped post-war attitudes toward occupation and reconstruction. The Marshall Plan and American aid to Japan succeeded in part because populations had already been conditioned to associate American power with material abundance rather than exploitation. The K-Ration had prepared the psychological ground for post-recovery by demonstrating that American wealth could be directed toward construction as easily as destruction. Cold War competition would later echo these same themes. Soviet leaders studied American military logistics obsessively, attempting to understand how a democratic society could mobilize resources more effectively than a command economy. The answer, visible in something as mundane as a field ration, lay in the productive capacity generated by relatively free markets, agricultural surpluses created by mechanized farming, industrial efficiency achieved through competition and innovation, and a governmental system capable of coordinating national effort without requiring totalitarian control. The K-Ration was not merely food, it was proof of concept, evidence that democratic capitalism could outproduce fascism and communism alike, that abundance was a form of power, and that a well-fed soldier, from Iowa or Texas or California, could defeat a fanatically indoctrinated soldier from Berlin or Tokyo, simply by representing a system that worked better. The psychological transformation experienced by Axis soldiers who encountered K-Rations was not instantaneous, nor was it universal. Ideological commitment could survive even the most overwhelming evidence of material disparity. SS troops continued fighting fanatically long after rational calculations suggested surrender. Japanese soldiers launched suicide attacks, despite understanding that their cause was lost. But for the majority of German and Japanese soldiers, men conscripted into armies rather than volunteering for ideological crusades. The K-Ration represented a crack in the edifice of propaganda, a sliver of truth that expanded over time. If their leaders had lied about American productive capacity, what else had they lied about? If American soldiers ate this well as a matter of routine, what did that suggest about American society? If a democracy could organize its resources this effectively, what was the value of fascist discipline and totalitarian control? The answers to these questions accumulated slowly, conversation by conversation, as captured soldiers compared notes in prisoner-of-war camps, as occupation troops distributed rations to civilians, as the reality of post-war reconstruction contradicted wartime propaganda. The K-Ration became a symbol not just of American abundance but of a different possibility, a society organized around different principles that nonetheless proved more effective at achieving collective goals. This realization did not make German or Japanese soldiers into democrats overnight, but it planted doubt, and doubt was enough. By the time Obergefreiter Klaus Huber sat down to write his memoir in 1958, 13 years after that first encounter with the K-Ration in a Belgian forest, he had spent more than a decade thinking about what that moment meant. He wrote, "We were taught that hardship built character, that suffering proved our superiority, that our willingness to endure privation demonstrated German strength. But the Americans taught us a different lesson. They showed us that abundance was not weakness but power, that a society capable of feeding its soldiers well, while simultaneously producing tanks and planes and ships by the tens of thousands, represented a form of organization we could not match. The K-Ration was not just food, it was a message. It said, you are fighting an enemy that operates according to principles you do not understand. An enemy whose strength derives not from discipline or ideology, but from productivity and prosperity. You cannot defeat abundance through sacrifice. You can only exhaust yourself trying." The K-Ration continued to serve in the American military through the Korean War, where Chinese and North Korean soldiers experienced their own revelations about American material capacity. By Vietnam, it had been replaced by more advanced rations, but the principle remained the same. American soldiers would be fed better than any military in history, not as a luxury but as a basic expectation. The evolution of military rations from K-Rations to Mr. Ease to today's highly specialized combat meals represents a continuous commitment to the idea that abundance is strategic, that soldiers fight better when well-fed, and that a wealthy society should use that wealth to support those who defend it. The cardboard box that the young Gefreiter opened in the Ardennes forest in January 1945 was designed to be discarded after use, thrown away like trash, forgotten, but its contents told a story that could not be forgotten, a story about what kind of society wins wars and why. The chocolates spoke of agricultural surpluses and chemical engineering. The cigarettes spoke of industrial capacity and supply chain management. The coffee spoke of global trade networks and commercial relationships. The biscuits spoke of food science and preservation technology. The toilet paper spoke of standards and expectations, and together, these components spoke a truth that propaganda could not counter, and ideology could not suppress. America had transformed prosperity into a weapon, and that weapon was more devastating than any bomb dot in the years after the war. As American power shaped the post-war order, the lessons of the K-Ration echoed through policy decisions and strategic planning. The Marshall Plan fed Europe with American grain, demonstrating that the same system capable of supplying military forces could rebuild devastated economies. Food aid to Japan helped stabilize occupation and prevent communist insurgency. Throughout the Cold War, American agricultural exports served as both humanitarian gesture and strategic tool, reminding populations from Berlin to Saigon that democratic capitalism produced food surpluses, while communist command economies produced famines. The K-Ration's success as bags of wheat, crates of powdered milk, pallets of canned goods continued, telling the same story. Abundance is power, prosperity is strength, and a society that feeds its people well is a society worth defending. The symbolic legacy of the K-Ration persists in unexpected ways. Veterans gathering at reunions still tell stories about K-Ration meals, complaining about the monotony while acknowledging that they never went hungry. Historians examining World War II logistics inevitably confront the reality that American victory was built as much on supply chains as combat prowess. Military planners studying contemporary conflicts recognize that soldier nutrition remains fundamental to operational effectiveness, and somewhere in archives and museums, original K-Ration boxes sit preserved behind glass. Artifacts of a moment when the United States demonstrated that it could feed millions of soldiers, fighting on every continent simultaneously, and still have enough left over to feed starving civilians in defeated enemy nations. The young Gefreiter in the Ardennes forest finished eating his captured K-Ration, carefully folded the empty box, and placed it in his pack. He would survive the war, surrender to American forces in April 1945, spend 2 years in a prisoner of war camp in Mississippi, where he ate American rations every day and gained 20 pounds, and eventually returned to Germany, where he would spend the rest of his life trying to explain what he had learned from a cardboard box in a frozen forest. The lesson was simple but profound. Wars are won by societies that can produce more, organize better, and distribute effectively. Ideology matters less than logistics. Faith matters less than factories. And a nation capable of packaging abundance into a box small enough to fit in a soldier's pocket is a nation that cannot be defeated by enemies who measure strength in sacrifice, rather than surplus. In the end, the K-Ration revealed what propaganda had hidden and what ideology had obscured. America's strength did not derive from superior courage or racial purity or spiritual discipline. It derived from something simultaneously more mundane and more powerful: the capacity to organize resources efficiently, distribute them equitably, and sustain operations through systematic productivity. The chocolate bars and coffee packets and cigarettes inside that waxed cardboard box represented the victory of democratic capitalism over fascist alternatives, not through moral superiority or divine favor, but through the simple mathematics of abundance. A well-fed soldier fights better than a starving one. A prosperous society mobilizes more effectively than an impoverished one, and a nation that treats feeding its warriors as a solved problem rather than a perpetual crisis will ultimately prevail over enemies who cannot solve that problem no matter how much they sacrifice. The snow continued falling over the Ardennes forest that January afternoon in 1945, covering the evidence of battle, blanketing the broken landscape in temporary silence. The Jeffreiter finished his meal, shouldered his rifle, and returned to a war he now understood his side had already lost. But the empty K-Ration box remained in his pack, a souvenir of revelation, proof that abundance was not a symptom of decadence but a source of strength, and that the American secret was no secret at all, just the obvious truth that prosperity defeats privation. Every time, without exception, the war would end 4 months later, and Germany would surrender, not just militarily but ideologically, forced to confront the reality that sacrifice without productivity is merely suffering, that discipline without abundance is merely tyranny, and that a society organized around hardship will always lose to a society organized around prosperity. The K-Ration had delivered this message more effectively than any speech or leaflet or broadcast could have done, because it was real and immediate and undeniable. A small cardboard box containing the end of the Third Reich,